Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
The Destroyer Comet. Note: the earliest recorded observation of this comet may have been in 1680. Great Comet of 1680. See also Moon origin. See also Santorini. See also Venus origin. Contact Report 005.
The flood 10,079 years ago, related to the year 1975, was caused by a gigantic comet, which has already caused a lot of damage and has been traversing the universe since time immemorial. We call it the Destroyer, and we know that it has already been racing through outer space for millions of years. According to your calculation of time, this dangerous comet has an orbital period of 575.12 years, and in the year 2255 of your calculation of time, it will again enter the realm of the Earth in a very dangerous way, unless its orbit is changed or even destroyed by some cosmic circumstances or by our planned efforts. The last passage of this comet took place 295 years ago, calculated from 1975, namely in the year 1680. 10,079 years ago, this giant comet, which had originated from a natural cosmic catastrophe, got very close to the realm of the Earth and almost destroyed it. Only the knowledge and ability of our ancestors, who had settled on the Earth and had begotten their descendants here, prevented the terrible end. Also, in the following millennia, the giant comet has always been a great threat to the Earth, and it will remain so too until one day it will be destroyed or diverted away. The last major catastrophe that emanated from this comet was about 3,500 years ago, as I have already mentioned. To be precise, it was 3,153 years ago according to your calculation of time. Due to this comet, an event took place, which is very rare in the universe, namely a planetary transplantation, by the monstrous gavault of this giant comet, a planet just developing life in a very distant planet system of the Sol system, was flung out of its orbit and driven out into the outer space in a trajectory parallel to that of the destructive giant comet. For more than 130 years, this planet then trailed far behind the giant and deviated only infinitely slowly from its path. Then, 3,453 years ago, the destroyer penetrated the terrestrial solar system and brought the planetary orbits into disorder by its gigantic forces. Passing close to Earth, it enshrouded ladder in its huge tail and shook it very hard. Immense storms and volcanic eruptions were the result. Human beings and animals died in large masses, mountains were shifted, and the ocean depths changed. In the Mediterranean Sea, the magma walls of the Santorini volcano were torn to pieces deep down, and large quantities of water penetrated. This caused an immense catastrophe since the volcano exploded thereby and destroyed the island. The explosion created a gigantic storm surge, which grew nearly 200 meters high into the sky and swept over the sea like a primeval monster. Everything in it was killed and crushed, and the water turned blood red. In Egypt, this storm surge flooded vast areas and caused all sorts of epidemics, while the tidal wave receded and continued racing northeast across the sea to destroy vast areas and all port cities on the eastern shore of the sea in present-day Syria. The comet, however, shot through the terrestrial solar system and raced around the sun again off into the outer space to return in 575.12 years. But the slower following planet, carried along in its wake, which was about the same size as the Earth, shot past the Earth at a distance of about 600,000 kilometers and was captured by the attraction force of the Sun. By its tremendous power, it forced the new planet into an orbit between its closest satellites, namely between Mercury and the Earth. And since then, this transplanted and immigrated planet has been known to the Earth humans, and he or she calls it Venus. Sure, but I am not finished yet. Because I want to tell you even more primordial things now. The prehistory of this comet so fateful for the Earth, which also brought the satellite, the moon over here, the fragment of a small planet from a very distant solar system. The Earth's moon, which originates from a small planet 4.5 million years older than the Earth. It was millions of years ago. Deep in the unknown space, in a space-time shifted solar system of the Milky Way, a solitary star floated far away from the normal orbits of the satellites orbiting the Sun. It was a dark star, devoid of any life, very dangerous in its unpredictable path into which it had been flung by an immense eruption of its original sun. This was when its original sun burst through all shaking explosions, and, in its destruction, partially destroyed the satellites orbiting it or hurled them as dangerous projectiles into the dark space. The sun itself then collapsed into itself and tore a hole in the outer space. Its material pressed itself together with monstrous gavolt and was compressed into a small mass. While the sun in its normal pulsating state had a diameter of 11 million kilometers, it now shrank down to a concentration of only 4.2 kilometers. As a result, the material was compressed in such a way that a single cubic centimeter weighed several thousand tons. Since then, it has hovered in space as a dark, gaping hollow which tears everything within millions of kilometers of its perimeter into itself, whatever it is capable of seizing and what falls under its spell. The dark star, which got flung away by it at that time, got caught again in a neighboring solar system and orbited it in an unpredictable path. In the field of the force of the huge sun, it orbited the sun's satellites for many millennia as well as the sun itself, testifying to the fact that it would sometime cause a catastrophe to fall upon the system. Yet still far away from the actual worlds, the dark planet, bare of any life, roamed through space. Powerfully and unapproachably, it drifted through the icy cold of the universe, as an outcast, as a wandering planet, as a stranger in a foreign system, dark, dangerous, and deadly. Within the hold of the far outstretched force arms of the sun, it came closer and closer over the course of thousands of years to the actual area of the system of satellites, which it had already been orbiting for such a long time at an ever-increasing speed. Imperceptibly, however, its course always became narrower and narrower, and year by year the extent of its danger grew. After the thousands of years, it then rushed suddenly and unexpectedly into the closest sphere of influence of the sun and its planets. Like a greedy monster, it emerged from the blackness of the universe and announced deadly destruction. Initially, it was only like a silhouette out of nowhere, but then it was recognized in a hazy and blurred way as a half-dark round disk. Now, already illuminated by the reflecting rays of the sun, it approached the orbit of the outermost planet at tremendous speed. But it was still millions of units away from the actual hearth of the peaceful calm, which, though, due to its gigantic size, it soon had to transform into a seething hell once it penetrated into the silence of this harmony. But still some time went by at first, until the giant finally strayed from his path and had moved into the most dangerous proximity. Now already recognizable as a round sphere, the destroyer reflected the sunlight while dragging a fine veil of luminous particles behind it. Still only a few hundred units away from the next worlds, it evoked hellish storms in these, which destroyed large areas that had been cultivated by the human beings peacefully emerging there. With trembling for their arduously gained goods and their already hard lives, they suddenly found themselves exposed to the immense and uncompassionate forces of the universe. Helpless, doomed to be handed over from life to death, they stared out into the sky, to the gigantic wandering planet which raced towards them as a cosmic mortal projectile. It was no more than a question of time before the forces of the cosmos had to unfold their monstrous powers. On the night of the third day after the incursion of the destroyer into the planetary pathways, the middle of the night may just have passed. The drifter from outer space entered the elliptical orbit of the sixth planet. Causing immense cosmic storms, it flung the planet belonging to the orbit a few units off its direction and brought it on a dangerous course towards the sun. Monstrous eruptions and storms tore apart the peaceful appearance of the planet thriving in its magnificence. Letting mountains collapse and casting seas out of their beds, it sought a new path around its sun for itself. Full of horror and consternation over the immense forces of nature, the human beings fled into the vast plains that covered the planet in great numbers. But the unleashed forces of nature were stronger than the will and the saving idea of the human beings. 2/3 of the humankind that inhabited the planet was killed and destroyed in the unleashed hell of nature. Wild waters tore away large parts of the mainland, while exploding volcanoes buried vast areas beneath glowing lava and turned them to rubble and ashes. The planet's daily rotation time doubled, and it circumnavigated the sun in the opposite direction. Forced by cosmic determinations, the survivors had to find a new beginning, devoid of any culture, set back to a primordial time of the development. The destroyer, however, continued racing through the system, spreading hell, death, and destruction. It crossed the path of the fifth planet, a world that was about to give birth to first life. Fortunately, at the time of the event, the latter was too far away from the point of crossing its orbital path to be seriously affected. Apart from mighty storms and minor quakes on land and at sea, there were no notable incidents on it. The fourth satellite of the system, however, would find its destruction in the Battle of the Worlds. As the smallest of all satellites, it stoically traversed its orbit, and from the perspective of anticipatory calculations, it had to cross the flight path of the Wanderer exactly when facing it head-on. And that's exactly what happened. It got into the irresistible destructive power of the giant. Like two wild monsters, the two planets raced towards each other, a giant and a dwarf. But before both of them could collide, immense explosions tore the lifeless dead dwarf planet apart. In the distant solar system, however, the destroyer continued to rage, destroying everything in its path. It flung the planet closest to the sun with unimaginable force towards the sun, in front of which it destroyed itself at a million-fold distance by immense eruptions and fell into the sun as smallest fragments and atomized. The destroyer itself drifted by a few units from its old course and shot past the sun in dangerous proximity, back into the expanses of the space, in order to take the same path as long times before the small planet did. Consequently, it also passed the dimension gate created by technically highly advanced human beings' hands and came into the space-time configuration of our Dern universe and into the area of the Milky Way and thus also into the Sol system. But due to the unimaginable heat of the blazing sun, the surface of the dangerous wanderer liquefied, and the glowing substances and particles flung away by its racing speed created behind it a shining tail hundreds of thousands of units long, shining as bright as the destroyer planet itself, which had now become deadly Comet. Due to the zero cold of the universe, the surface of the Wanderer quickly solidified again. But its illuminating power remained with it, as did the shining tail. Myriads and myriads upon myriads of smallest particles and substances have covered it ever since, inundating it and following it as long tail when it comes into the realm of a sun, shining and showing the beings of the universe the path of the comet. Due to the continuous sequence of meteor dust, particles, substances, and the corpuscular radiation of the suns, it will never lose its illuminating power again until one day it will fall victim to its destruction. It will still wander through space for thousands or further millions of years before it itself has turned into dust by the grinding particles or is captured and destroyed by a sun. Millions of years have already elapsed since its emerging, and its course is still unpredictable. Due to all sorts of cosmic forces, it often changes its course in the SOL system quite unexpectedly and endangers, among others, its unfinished solar systems of Jupiter and Saturn. But by and large, its dangerous path is that stable that it passes through the same planetary systems again and again over the course of 575 years, albeit with variations in the distance of up to 1 million kilometers.
Contact Report 029.
Millions of years ago, a giant dark star in another space-time configuration destroyed half a planetary system in many light-years distance from the earthly system. After the destruction of that distant system, the Wanderer rushed out into the vastness of space, entered the space-time structure of the Milky Way of the Dern universe, and set course for Earth. By large and small planets and by the sun, it was forced into a new course, which consequently had to bring it again and again into the SOL system. Known as the Destroyer, it stubbornly followed its new course, and over the course of millions of years created a firm path for itself. But this orbit often led the Destroyer uncontrollably to planetary systems or other wandering stars or comets, which were pushed off course by its gigantic size or attracted by its attraction and destroyed or abducted. This also happened only a few thousand years ago when this gigantic destroyer tore an object into its tow and brought it many millions of kilometers outside of the Earth's range, to the earthly planetary system. The destroyer itself passed very far out of Earth's range, while the object in tow, however, came dangerously close to Earth and caused devastating disasters. The whole solar system got into disorder at that time, and all planets were pushed into new orbits. But the harmony-destroying object was forced into an orbit between Earth and Mercury by the gravity of the large planets and the Sun, and was unable to leave the system. And as the brightest planet of the Sol system, the dragged object orbits the Sun since then and is called Venus by the Earth humans.
Contact Report 061.
Can you give me more detailed data on the Destroyer and Venus? I mean, can you tell me its orbit time and its context? And can you tell me which system was Venus torn away from? You once said that the Destroyer practically stole this planet from a distant system. And what about the distant systems that the Destroyer goes through again and again?
I can give you very precise details about that, but we are occupied with a puzzle. It is still an unsolved mystery to us how some concerns relate to the Destroyer, especially the recurring constant speed of this giant comet. Its orbit time always returns to a constant of 575.5 years, Although it has large intermediate fluctuations of up to 205 years, which means that during a few orbits it drops down to 478 years due to the mutual gravitational pull of different planets and the Sun, and it rises up to 683 years due to the reciprocal mass attraction of the Sun, and after a few orbits, it returns to its constant orbit time of 575.5 years, which is very puzzling to us and finds no parallels known to us. Our scientists have calculated that this phenomenon occurs at extremely irregular intervals, and that the destroyer, as soon as it has reached its 575.5-year orbital period again, comes again and again into very dangerous proximity to the Earth and mostly causes enormous destruction. According to our scientific research, the escape velocity of the SOL system plays a crucial role in this peculiar phenomenon, which moves at enormous speed towards the Hercules constellation. However, this is not the only factor, because further calculations and research show that the planetary systems of the SOL system are also decisively involved in this peculiar orbital period of the destroyer, which becomes constant again and again, because, as I explained to you earlier, the giant passes through the same systems again and again. Venus was torn out of Uranus's system by the gravitational pull effect of the destroyer and by various other factors and drifted on the destroyer's trajectory, in its wake, so to speak, apart from the fact that the comet giant was much faster and left its appendage far behind. This happened about 8,590 years ago from the present time, that is to say, during a destroyer passage through the SOL system, before it had reached the constant of 575.5 years again. In this run, the orbit of the comet was 632 years, 57 years above the constant of 575.5 years, which is so puzzling to us. This orbit paused Venus until 7,157 years ago, thus over 632 years, cycle duration, when the destroyer came again and changed its orbit again and brought it on course towards Earth, while the giant itself came into dangerous proximity to the Earth and caused violent destruction and flooding. This was the second deluge of the last 12,000 years caused by the destroyer. Through these events, the destroyer once again changed its orbiting time and went through the SOL system on the next run without causing any damage, passing very far away from the Earth. Already at the next passage, however, it had the constant of 575.5 years again, namely 6,906 years ago, and again Venus got into its orbit and changed its course again, but now so much that it got into orbit near the Earth and around the central star. It stayed there until 4,058 years ago, when it was affected in its orbit again during the next passage of the giant comet. At that time, the destroyer had an orbital period of 605 years. But then, 3,153 years ago, the destroyer, which had regained the 575.5-year constant, came back, shot past the planet that was constantly thrown out of orbit at a distance of a few 100,000 kilometers, and finally tore it into its orbit, which Venus now inevitably and finally had to bring to Earth. After a short time, the destroyer shot past the Earth, in its wake Venus, which came very close to the Earth, and caused the Santorini catastrophe. Since then, the destroyer has again had a very different cycle time over several rounds and has no longer affected the SOL system if minor irregularities are ignored. So it was not until 1680 that it reached the constant of 575.5 years again, when it passed through the SOL system again, but this time in an almost peaceful ride and without causing any changes. Therefore, its next run will again be 575.5 years if it reappears in 2255. What is also important and very interesting to mention is the fact that in the case of this gigantic comet, the inexplicable phenomena of the balancing constant of 575.5 years, which appears again and again, is joined by a second and equally inexplicable phenomenon, namely that the orbital period of the destroyer always and without exception balances out in such a way that two orbits always result in 1,151 years. That is to say, 575.5 years in duplicate. For example, if the cycle time is 478 years for one round, then the cycle time for the next round is 673 years with complete certainty. At least that is what the average calculations say. In any case, it is the case that even if longer non-constant circulations come to light, the years phenomenally always and without exception balance each other out again. It is a phenomenon that is known to our science as unique and actually finds no parallels at all.
But one more question concerning the destroyer. Does it penetrate our planetary systems, or even our solar system at all during every passage?
Of course, this is always the case, but sometimes it passes the Sol so far away that it is hardly visible.
Oh, and has that also happened here and there in the last 12,000 years?
Absolutely.